organizations should be expanded beyond acts like recruiting, propaganda, weapons supply, etc., to include traditionally feminine tasks, including domestic labor, educating parents, and bringing up children in the ideology. Alright, same motion. Perfect. Without further ado, I'd now like to invite the Prime Minister to be here.
Is this still a little volume all right for this room? Okay, is anybody not ready? Wonderful. Two simple arguments from OG. Number one, this stops the root cause of terrorism, which is socialization, which enables the mental state you need to be in to commit terrorism in the first place. This saves lives and makes better politics. And second, the legal system has a principal obligation to uphold people's dignity by prosecuting people who've done immoral acts, like supporting terrorism. Now, a little bit of setup. I think be careful about what the changes are. Change number one, there are new things you can be, have legal action taken if you're against. You're educating your children in the ideology. If you're giving people domestic support, stuff like that, this is now a crime, where before it might not have been. This means the government can now use legal tools against you. For example, you can now be forced to testify in court. You can now be detained, and now you can do things like be interrogated. This necessarily cannot happen if you've not committed another crime. And since terrorist organizations are always sophisticated and smart, they often make sure people who are sophisticated, important for their brainwashing, have not committed any crimes, so they necessarily cannot be detained or interrogated. This necessarily must change, now that brainwashing in and of itself is a crime. Second, there are additional charges, i.e., when you bring out traditional terrorists, they likely also been involved in at least so much of these things. This gives you as prosecutors more negotiating power, because you have more charges and more ability to say force plea deals through. I say we can put even more charges on you. And third, I want to note, you still would have your rights. For example, if you can prove you were forced into this and you were coerced, then you necessarily will not be charged for this, or things like that. What is good in and of itself, because you can prove that someone else forced you to participate in terrorism, they deserve to get punished for that, and now they will get punished for that. Sure, it's appeal right.
How does a woman in an ISIS camp ever prove that she was coerced into taking those actions?
I mean, the same way we do any other thing. But I want to note, this isn't just about ISIS, it's also about other forms of domestic terrorism, other forms of terrorist organizations, right? It isn't just about Islamic extremism. Now, first piece of positive matter. This stops terrorism. The crucial question we have to ask is, why do people do terrorism? Yes, it's a political strategy, but you have to be one willing to kill other people and think their lives are worth less than your political aims. This necessarily goes against human moral intuition. Because number one, you have to hate people so much you are okay with their death for their ends, and two, you have to be willing to risk your life. Most terrorists know they either will die or they're at least likely to die. This means you have to guard against your moral intuition, you have to preserve your own life and to preserve the life of others. And no, humans are social creatures, so we tend to want to not hurt other people. So you have to go out under extreme mental coercion to be willing to do this. This requires sophisticated brainwashing. This requires belonging to a community that pushes you into doing these things. It requires people telling you, no, this is justified, this is being human. It requires years of brainwashing. You cannot be simply convinced to do these things at the flick of a button. This means we need to, if we get rid of the sophisticated brainwashing network, things like terrorism are going to go away. How do we stop this? Three things. Number one, get legal tools to intervene. Most people recruiting for terrorism are literally doing things like posting on the internet, or texting people, or trying to get them to come to the camp in the first place. Often, these aren't necessarily fully crimes. Or, for example, you might go to someone's house and they're serving you dinner, and they're telling you, oh, this ideology is so good. Right? These are things that are not necessarily crimes. Now we get the right to legal intervention. The counterfactual is this did not exist. So now the police are able to come and detain you and interrogate you and ask you questions, learn who you've talked to and talk to them. We can at least get more information, which we could not do that in the counterfactual. Second, it deters it. Note, the people doing the domestic labor often are less committed than the terrorists. Why? They're not the ones doing the terrorism. They aren't the ones putting their lives at risk. This means they are necessarily less committed, which means they're easier to deter. I.e., if you say, look, you are going to go to jail if you do this, a large number of these people are going to be willing to quit because they are less committed. This necessarily means, to the extent if you believe that people are at least somewhat rational, some number of people will quit. This is important because a small number of people can make a big impact. I.e., for example, if one relatively influential person quits, there's a significant number less terrorists. And third, simple. It allows you to get more intelligence. When you arraign on someone, you can now arrest, say, the people who are involved in domestic activities, and you get information from them, whereas otherwise you often couldn't arrest them. right? For example, many of Osama bin Laden's wives had not on paper committed any crime despite supporting him. We couldn't get information from them. This is bad because these people often know a lot about terrorist networks and use them to clamp down on terrorism. Why do they know this? One, norms. There was a sense that they should be involved in the domestic side of this. And two, they're involved in the social life of all of this, right? There are sophisticated social networks to brainwash people, and women, and well, not just women, but people are generally very involved in it. And the people who are organizing those dinner parties have a lot of information. Why is this good? Two reasons. One, it saves lives because we stop terrorist attacks. Life comes prior to any other right, so if we're saving a large number of people, we should protect their rights. Second, is a better politics. In real world, there's a bunch of terrorism, you can't speak freely because you know you might get killed, and you can't advocate for things that are associated with terrorism because you'll get backlash and be having vigilantes as a result. In a world where there's less terrorism, there's better political discourse, because none of it is associated with terrorism. Now, principle. This is justified. One thing we know intrinsically is good is bodily autonomy. Your body is intrinsic to you, and you know that when someone else violates that, they take in something that intrinsically is part of you and harm them. We also know reciprocity is good. Why do we know this? We know that no one is better than other people. This means you have a reciprocal right to bodily autonomy. Other people must respect your bodily autonomy, and you must respect theirs. The problem is, if you do not punish people who do things to violate your bodily autonomy, like terrorism, this creates a privilege for moral actors. It violates your dignity, because people who violate your bodily autonomy can get away without being punished for it, and you as a moral actor get punished by the fact your bodily autonomy was violated. This is an uneven system. The legal system has an obligation to punish this. Why is this? It is the only system that can punish this in a fair way. You can't have outside punishment outside the legal system because it's vigilante justice. It's unlikely to be to the same scale and justified. It's unlikely to make sure that the person actually deserved it or they fully violated your bodily autonomy. And having no punishment is bad because one, it means people who try to harm others with bodily autonomy get a privilege in society, and it means victims don't feel whole. It violates their dignity because they know when they go outside, they're in the same society where their family and friends' bodily autonomy was harmed and nothing was done for it. There's a psychological harm on them. What's the analogy? If someone commits murder, even if we know they're never going to do it again to see the future, it is still wrong not to punish them for it. Necessarily, this means that people are participating in terrorism, which is immoral and violates people's bodily autonomy, we must have the legal system specifically punish them. How do you weigh this? Number one, it's pride. This determines what actions we can and cannot take. You wouldn't push a fat man off the bridge and say shoot you live because that's not in your moral toolbox. If we know that people who commit crimes or do something immoral rather must be punished, then the legal system must be designed such that it does that. So even though when killer attacks are bad, it still must happen. Second, it's universal. Every instance someone participates in terrorism and is not punished, we know something bad has happened. Whereas utilitarian stuff is relatively hard to calculate.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech. I'd now like to invite the Leader of Opposition here.
Starting on my first word, 3, 2, 1. I think side government loses this case the minute they fail to realistically characterize what these women look like. And I think that's really where this debate really starts, is when you actually visualize what these women look like. Most of these tend to be women that are attached to the wrong man, and they don't necessarily ever really know that they're attached to the wrong man. They go on usually like some kind of excursion, holiday in Turkey, and then their man tells them, hey, we're going to actually take a slight detour, and then they find themselves in these situations. We tell you the very point at which they have no initial bind to actually getting involved with this practice is the minute that you cannot carry out this legal proceeding against them. I think for any kind of justice to take place, you have to prove two basic things, right? Occurrencia, mens rea, action and intention. And I think to the extent at which we can prove to you that there is neither any kind of free will action, neither is there any kind of free will intention on the parts of these women, that they are actually incapable of being sued. And that's the burden that we present to you in the House today, right? Before I move on to my big substantive, which is about fairness in the justice system, I have a few points of rebuttal, right? I think they keep banking on this thing about terrorists also being brainwashed. I think the primary distinction here is that the recruitment pipeline looks extremely different, right? The kinds of information sources that terrorists subscribe to are largely ones that they buy into themselves, right? Like I have to go and click on certain videos, I have to go and read certain blog posts, or surround myself, or like find myself in a position where I'm constantly going back to that same source of information that I know is passing on a certain ideology. In the case of most of these women or most of these people that find themselves in terrorist outfits, they don't even know they're part of the terrorist outfit until they find themselves in the center of it. To the great extent, their recruitment is done contingent on some man that actually manipulates them or coerces them into that action. I think one also extremely key piece of characterization here is the distinction between women that are on the front line. I don't think all women are actually just doing feminine tasks, right? I think the women that are engaging in the feminine tasks are strategically allocated as the women that don't have the same kind of motivation or like the same kind of entrenchment in the ideology. Those women are not trusted in the front lines because they might turn in those extremely vulnerable situations. They might turn in those extremely vital conditions. And we're completely fine in like kind of prosecuting women that are in the front lines, prosecuting women that are like setting up bombs, etc. The problem is these low intention, low entrenchment, low ideology women that are not even entrusted in the front lines, that are only entrusted with these low value tasks that they want to then prosecute on their side. Okay, let's look at the substantive then, which is about fairness and justice. I think, one, the actions committed by these women are completely beyond their control. They have no agency or capacity to find them out. I think this is another key distinction between a man and the system. Let me prove to you through some mechanisms, right? Let's look at four main things. One, the force of terrorism. I think this cannot be understated, right? To the extent that a terrorist outfit is not afraid to take very, very aggressive or violent action against a woman that is kind of trying to defect or trying to break out of the system, they have no agency to leave the system. You cannot prosecute someone that has no agency to leave the system, right? They're threatened with death, rape on the daily, but even if they don't follow the second, which is harm to children, right? So usually the narrative that they have to face is, hey, okay, if you've managed to get away, if you managed to escape, if you managed to somehow defect from the camp, we will essentially go after your family, we will go after your children that are left behind. They have no way to actually buy into that risk-reward trade-off. We don't think there's a fair comparative there, right? C, we talk about the Stockholm syndrome. Right? I think to some extent these women are completely in captivity with these men, usually these terrorists, and they have no ideological control because they're manipulated on the daily, right? Like the Stockholm syndrome is a very real problem in which they have no control over the actions that they're then taking on. Second, and then again, we tell you the most important point that's distinguishing them, I'll take you closer to 5, the most important point that's distinguishing them with brainwashed men is the fact that women play a certain role within these movements, right? Women play a certain, or have a certain spot within the hierarchy, and I think that's essentially what distinguishes them. The fact that women are seen as second-class citizens means that they have no voice of control, particularly over their own circumstances. They're forced to follow extremely hyper-misogynistic ideals. Right? To the extent that a man still has some delta, some agency compared to a woman, and I think that's completely realistic for you to buy into, we tell you that there's no way that you can prosecute the women. I've already talked about pipelines for inclusion, to the extent that they have to provide that there was some initial buy-in from the women, which we don't think they can in a fair, realistic world, right? But let's look at other things, right? Let's look at action, if we've covered the intention part. I think also it has to be said that the actions they're committing are more indirect, right? Compared to a man that's going out and killing people on the front line, that's bombing people, that's actually responsible for civilian casualties. The fact is these women are responsible only for indirect actions, right? And these are essentially inherently distinct because they don't have the same amount of capacity for destruction. They also don't have the same amount of capacity for quantification, things that I will move on to more in my impacts. Before I do, I'll take one from closing.
Do you think men who have basically no agency within terrorist cells do terrorism, should they be held criminally liable or no?
I think to the extent that this man is involved in the same feminine tasks, sure, right? To the extent that they're responsible for the same kind of contribution and they're not actually in any way different from the women that are in these situations, fine, we're fine with that. Because I don't think feminine tasks essentially excludes this notion to women. It's anyone that's taking on those lower value chain propositions within the whatever terrorist outfit or whatever, right? But let's look at wrongful convictions, right? The impacts on a principal level is that you're not giving a fair sentence. And I think that's something that they really have to justify is why is this wrongful conviction? Fine, because I've proven to you that there is no clear action and intention on the part of these people. But why is it particularly bad for these women? I think three big reasons here. One, terrorists have no incentive to concede that they coerced a woman, right? The extent that I go up and I concede that, hey, I coerced this woman, I run the risk of them calling out all of my secrets, them going out and testifying against me and all of those things. I don't think terrorists ever have an incentive to prove coercion. But secondly, actions like these have unquantifiable metrics, right? You leave a lot of room for just speculation, because things like educating or labor or whatever don't have quantifiable casualties associated with them. To that extent, you can't necessarily prove exactly what harm was committed, and that leaves them so much more room for speculation, which again leaves more room for wrongful conviction. But third, there's no way to prove coercion, right? And I think this is particularly bad. They think coercion is this all-encompassing safety net or whatever. I don't think there's any way for a woman that's lived in an Islamic State camp or whatever all her life to come in and then prove coercion. You need things like eyewitness testimonies, but those don't really exist, I've already proven to you. Then what does this come down to? This comes down to then what the jury thinks, so this comes down to what the political will is. The political will is disproportionately against anyone that's associated with a terrorist outfit. I don't think they're ever getting the benefit of the doubt in that situation, so that for those reasons, there's always wrongful conviction. Further, it also furthers the terrorist action. On our side, women are fine with complying with the legal proceedings because they know they have protection. On their side, they know that they are likely to be sued, so they're less likely to come out and whistleblow because, hey, I might get in trouble with the law as well if I come and comply with the law, right? I might myself get in trouble if I try to whistleblow. I think on their side, you have more kind of propagation of these activities because I've proven to you that on a principle and a practical level, women and all of society is worse off. Please side with opening opposition.
Okay, everyone ready?
Yep.
Firstly, I want you to note that terrorism occurs in places with democracies that have access to gender equality. Think, for example, domestic terrorists in the United States, or those crazy cults in Japan that spread bombs in subways, for example. These are places where women who are doing feminine tasks, or men who are doing feminine tasks, can have the option of leaving when they're able to, because they have, robust legal systems that they can turn to for help to get away from the cults they're a part of. Which means that I don't think a lot of their arguments actually make very much sense. But even if it is true that all of these people are in Islamic extremist groups, which are probably the only groups that they're talking about, even if all of these people were in fact coerced to do so, then the legal system will just find them as having been coerced to do so, and then nothing will change, because none of those people were being charged with the status quo anyways. Where you have a delta then, for certain, is the places in which people probably weren't being coerced to do so. Though to be fair, obviously not all of these women are being coerced into doing these tasks, some of them obviously very much so believe in those ideologies. But the clear delta on domestic and Western terrorist groups, for example, are still going to exist. For example, people who promote terrorism on social media, people who were like, yes, go to the Capitol riot, this is such a good idea. The instigators of the Capitol riot who weren't actually there, but they were making infographics, or people who paid for those plane tickets, or people who housed people on their way to terrorist attacks, for example. I think all of those people very much so have a choice, and very much so should be prosecuted in the system because they were choosing to do these terrorist attacks. Then on this argument about how women essentially aren't being trusted on the front lines, so the women who are being put not on the front lines are the ones who are going to be least trusted. This is actually probably not true, right? Because I think terrorist organizations are relatively intelligent, as Nick Carter characterizes you, which means that they probably know that their education and administrative roles are actually extremely important for the longevity of their organization, which means that they're probably more likely to have women who have more knowledge and especially more education in the system of the terrorist organization be in the back lines, because they know that if you put them on the front lines, that they're likely to die, and then they're not going to be able to use their skills to better your organization. Which means you're probably going to put the most valuable people on the back lines. This is the reason why the heads of terrorist organizations are never suicide bombers, for example. This means that these are probably the women who are most entrenched in the ideology and most likely to actually be true believers and not be coerced into the system. The ones who are actually being coerced into the system are probably going to be sent, for example, as suicide bombers on the front lines, as they characterize themselves. Then this argument, furthermore on the argument about how women have no agency to leave the organization, 4 pieces of rebuttal here. First, I don't actually think it is true that they have no way to escape, because because I think lots of governments who are anti-terrorist and NGO groups operate extensively to create opportunities for these people to run away. This is because it is strategically valuable for you to target the people who are most important in upholding the structure of these terrorist organizations, which means that in places where you have large amounts of terrorist organization, you also have government organizations coming in regularly and trying to help these people escape in the best way possible. Yes, it is still difficult, but for many people, it is in fact possible. Secondly, obviously not all these people don't want to be there. For example, obviously not all these people don't want to be there, and the fact that you recognize that terrorist raids, when you actually get people who are like in the home country or in the place where the terrorism is occurring, tend to operate based on lots of intelligence. Like you're watching these bases for long periods of time, possibly months or even years, which means that you have like footage of these people doing their day-to-day lives. You probably have embedded agents, for example, which means you have significant amounts of evidence as to whether or not these people are actually being coerced, which means it's really unlikely to get a false conviction, because you actually have way more evidence on these cases than you do on the vast majority of cases that are even being prosecuted in Western liberal democracies in the first place, which means the standard of evidence is actually going to be significantly higher. Thirdly, the process of determining whether or not you are actually guilty is still a good process, because in the status quo, you cannot charge them with anything, which means that they never actually go to court, which means you never have the evidentiary process in the first place. But if you were able to detain these people for some period of time, at least until they are proven innocent, then you could then go ahead and do the interrogations and the plea deals, etc. But my partner tells you are so important for being able to get the intelligence to stop future terrorist attacks. That is still a good thing, even if they are found innocent. And fourthly and finally, this argument just boils down to if you are brainwashed into the system and you can't leave, then you should never be held guilty. As my partner tells you, every single terrorist is brainwashed into the system, which by their own argumentation, then no terrorist should be held guilty. But it's obviously not true. Terrorists are bad people, and they should probably be held guilty, for the things that they do. Their argument obviously doesn't only hold true for feminine attacks, right? Like, do you really think the average rank and file soldier of a terrorist organization wants to be there? I think that's probably not true. The reason for this is probably because, for example, in World War II, you read the diaries of many kamikaze pilots, you read that they actually didn't want to do that, but they were really scared for what would happen to their families or what would happen to themselves if they were to refuse to do those orders. So it's just the same kind of things that happens to very many terrorist organizations in the modern day. But I think that it's probably intuitive that these people should probably be punished. Okay, before that one.
Do you not think there's any difference between the recruitment pipeline for a brainwashed terrorist versus a woman that was coerced into the systems?
Literally no. They're upholding terrorists and they're killing innocent people. I think it's a terrible thing. If you kill an innocent person, you should be punished for that. Okay, on to our case then. In democratic nations, those that uphold the rule of law, in which this case actually matters, you cannot detain someone without charging them with a crime. This means that you cannot subject them to interrogations, and they can leave at any time. Some problems. First, people in traditionally support roles in the status quo do not get interrogated for information. Second, you cannot offer them plea deals in exchange for information, which means that even if they have information, you have no way of getting it out of them. And thirdly, if they are interrogated, which sometimes they are, it is outside of the judicial system, somewhere like Guantanamo Bay, meaning more creation of those covert facilities, which inevitably detain even more innocents because they never give you access to trials. I think then, if you believe it is important to give people access to trials and not detain innocent people, it is much better in our system, because we believe that the government has equal incentives to detain these people on either side of the world, because the government wants to stop terrorist attacks. They know these people have information, which means that they cannot do it legally. The vast majority of governments in the world, places that experience terrorist attacks like Russia or other places, are going to detain these people anyways, and they are going to do it illegally, and that is going to create more covert facilities, which causes more innocent people to suffer. Okay, we think people in these feminine roles are just much more likely to, first of all, know the information because they are able to operate in the background, be unacknowledged, whereas men who are officially in the leadership positions, for example, often don't have access to higher up meetings, whereas women who are maybe serving food or something like that oftentimes do have access. And secondly, because they often sort the documentation, do the administrative roles, for example, so they've literally read the documents. And secondly, we think they're just more likely to give this info up because they are not trained to resist interrogation, because they were never expected to be caught, which means that interrogating them is much more effective than interrogating someone else with equal amounts of information. The impact is pretty clear. Advanced knowledge of a terrorist attack is the best way to stop a terrorist attack. These people can also give info about the leadership structure and supply organization, allowing governments to attack the root of the issue and also avoid accidentally attacking civilian facilities where they may have bad information about, which causes less civilian deaths. Terrorist attacks are bad. I don't think I need to explain the reason behind this. Innocent people die, which means that if you believe in the principle, which is autonomy, you must believe that life is prior to autonomy because you cannot make any decisions if you are dead, which means that we must uphold lives first and foremost, which means that we must stop terrorist attacks, which can, at individual moments, cause hundreds and not thousands of deaths at once. Thanks.
I thank them for their prize speech. I would now like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to hear.
If opening opposition is able to prove to you that there is a difference between the individuals who are recruited, who buys into these terrorism ideologies, and the people who are actively coerced, people who are victims of the system, are fundamentally different, then we're able to take this debate, which is what I'm going to do during my speech. The speech is going to be very simple. I'm going to go down OG's case, as well as rebuild my partner's arguments. But let's start with the OG case, right? They tell you about this idea how essentially they're going to be able to stop the root cause of terrorism. You know, it fundamentally goes against human morals, it requires a lot of brainstorming. All of these characterizations we agree with, and we don't think actually like ties into the motion, right? But they then tell you about this like interesting idea that comes out of their DPM, which is this idea that like you can easily prove coercion, right? If people are actually coerced, then they will face no accountability in legal courts. We have several issues with this. First, we tell you coercion is something that's inherently very difficult to prove, right? Like oftentimes you need actual physical, tangible evidence to show that somebody coerced you. And given that it is a terrorist organization with very intelligent people organizing, as OG characterizes, they're not going to leave traces of this kind of coercion to be easily caught by the court. And therefore, oftentimes these people are going to be wrongfully convicted, like my partner says. But furthermore, they tell you about this really strange idea that like, oh, because these terrorist organizations are so intelligent, they're going to put the women with the most amount of buy-in into somehow like these educational and administrative roles and not send them on the front lines. We have huge issues with this kind of characterization, right? First, we tell you going to the front lines is a very high-risk operation, right? Because that is somebody who is going out into the world, given like some level of autonomy to do whatever they can. If this person does not have strong buy-in into this ideology, they're oftentimes a high-risk individual. This means they're likely to sabotage the mission, but also this means you are likely having very little control over this individual, right? When you're keeping this individual in the headquarters, doing things like cleaning and cooking in the kitchen, you're able to exert a lot more control and ensure this person is actually in compliance, right? So we think what is the likely scenario then, in both sides of the world, is that these people with less buy-in, or people who are coerced into these kind of organizations, because of the organizational structure, are very much likely to be in these kind of domestic labor positions, which is why we're advocating for this, right? But furthermore, like we tell you that, like yes, there are going to be women who probably actually buy into this kind of ideology and are recruited to join. And we think oftentimes these people are the ones who are going to be actually sent on these missions. But furthermore, we tell you these individuals probably also want to be sent on to frontline missions, right? If you have such high buy-in into this like crazy ideology, you probably want to do something like in alliance with your goal and probably commit some actions that aligns with your goal. So we think on the individual level, they also probably want to partake on this in a large level. So overall, I think we're able to prove to you that there is a fundamental difference between the individuals who are committing these domestic labor tasks and they are oftentimes coerced into it. Furthermore, let's talk about their other ideas about how people can just quit, right? Like there's runaway organizations that help individuals escape. We think this is unlikely for a couple of reasons, and I think my partner talks about this, but I think he highlights to you some reasons about why terrorism is inherently tied to violence. Therefore, individuals are oftentimes scared to leave because they're scared of further violence committed against them. But also things like Stockholm syndrome, children and family. But furthermore, we tell you that oftentimes it's extremely difficult to escape, right? Because the terrorist organization does not want you to be giving out information about their organizations away to public and to other people in society. So oftentimes, there is no alternative such as leaving because the alternative would be death. Even if they won't take violent action, there is that perception level there from being in terrorist organizations, right? You've seen what these people are able to do. You've seen how many individuals they've killed. You probably are scared that you're going to end up as one of those individuals. So oftentimes, you're complying with a lot of these tasks due to the human nature of wanting to survive. We don't think that should be a crime. You like? Alright, furthermore, then they give you this really interesting idea about how it's so much easier to interrogate these individuals and you're going to get much more intel and it's going to help you tackle the system. Okay, I'd really like to tell you why this is not true, right? Because we tell you, in open governance world, these individuals are aware, hey, I can be prosecuted by the legal system. Therefore, I'm probably less likely to comply with the legal system, right? We tell you these individuals oftentimes probably have some level of mistrust to the government because of the propaganda they've gone through. Therefore, they need to feel like, hey, I'm not going to get criminally in trouble for the things that I tell. And we think it is only in status quo then, where they know they will not be prosecuted. They know that when they speak up, they are actually going to be protected. We can engage these people in things like the witness protection program, where they're actually able to tell us the 100% truth and give us intel on how to better dismantle these terrorist organizations. We think even if we were weighing this debate off of the metric of which side better protects or better tackles these terrorist organizations, it's going to be in the status quo in which these individuals feel comfortable with speaking up. And also then in OG's world, you're also going to get a much tighter system where the terrorist organizations are probably going to be exerting a lot more control on these individuals who are doing domestic labor projects, right? Because they're scared that these individuals are ultimately going to get prosecuted by the legal system, and ultimately their system is going to collapse. So this means they're probably going to utilize a lot more violence against these individuals who are coerced into it, which makes it ultimately worse at all. I'll take a POI from closing or opening.
Your principle of justice is never violated because common law courts use a beyond a reasonable doubt standard for criminal cases. So if you are being coerced, you will never be found guilty. So you never violate the principle.
Okay, George, I think OG fundamentally lacks a mechanism in which how coercion can be proven, right? Like they tell you these things about the ideas of security camera footage and things like that, but that doesn't inherently prove coercion, right? Coercion requires some individual directly telling someone else that, hey, if you don't do this, you're going to face violence, and oftentimes these tracks are going to be covered up. But even let's take OG at their best case scenario, right? We tell you, okay, these people go into court, even if they're found innocent, we tell you this is still extremely harmful because you're wasting the legal procedure, or you're wasting the resources of the legal system, right? You're spending time, energy, you're prosecutors to prosecute an individual that proves to be innocent at the end of the day, while those efforts could have been directed towards the people who are actively recruiting, the people who are actively doing violence out there, and the people who are actually key to dismantling a terrorist organizations. So even at God's best case scenario in which these people are actually proven the innocent, which we don't think is very likely due to the systematic reasons my partner gives you, this is still ultimately going to be a worse off world, right? Fundamentally, I think we need to care about these individuals because they're also victims in this scenario. Under open government's world, they are going to face a high likelihood of wrongful conviction in which they are forced to spend their rest of life in jail because they made one wrong decision in their lives. We think we need to spend our efforts then on focusing on the individuals who are actively doing harm, the individuals who are out there taking lives, if OG cares about lives so much. On this very simple basis, very, very proud to oppose.
For their speech, and I now invite the member of government here.
A few key clarifications and points of framing before I talk about why this is probably going to be done well and get good information on terrorist organizations that is necessary, and then two, why we stop the roots of terrorism and why this is so important to take on. First, in terms of key clarifications and framing. First, we think that the rule of law is already probably significantly, is probably weak enough to the point in the developing world, insofar as individual officers probably will act in their own will, often in many cases in punishing a lot of these women to begin with, right? I think in many cases, the model, there's a punish as you see fit kind of system that is probably, and you are encouraged structurally to punish a lot of people who are engaging within these tasks because they're seen as antithetical to the things that your government stands for. They're seen as that you see the harms that they are causing to the people around you. It's probably exceptionally hard to regulate the extent to which you are treating these women when you come across a labor sort of area, right? Or you come across an educational facility. It is significantly hard to impose regulations for how you're specifically dealing with women. In a lot of cases, it is up to officer discretion, and oftentimes you don't have necessarily developed systems that regulate the way in which these women are treated in the first place. We would say that this discretion is probably also just as bad, if not worse, in many cases. Two, we think it's pretty obvious that you probably have some degree of customizability within this punishment to begin with. right? And I think this is relative to one, the extent of involvement, and you probably have some degree of prosecutional discretion when you are able to, when you are probably like punishing these women, and the extent to which it is probably beneficial for the court to do so in punishing these women in the first place. 3, you probably have systems of developed sort of legal research into what it looks like to, and what the role of these women specifically within these organizations, or what the role of like feminine like tasks within these organizations even looks like given this motion, right? I think what this means is that the specific academic and legal sort of discourse on what the function of these roles necessarily apply to. What that means is that this debate only applies in cases where there is a reasonable enough rule of law to engage within, to encourage people to engage in this form of this form of policing over the alternative, which is just like law enforcement will just do whatever they see as fit in that situation. You probably need some degree of like development, but it's probably not development that's good enough to I don't know, maybe stop terrorism from occurring in the first place. 4th, I think and this is the last sort of justification, is that people probably just deserve this punishment. I don't think O is like standards for like, I don't think O is like, justification holds up here. Because domestic labor education and like bringing up children is oftentimes just as harmful and just as like morally flawed as what they're describing, right? So if I'm contributing a new child who's about to go and like kill like 10 people, it is unclear why this is fundamentally different from me just killing one guy. I think there's an incentive for me to continue educating. Okay, important stuff then on our case. 1, why does this stop? Why does this save lives and in terms of gathering information? Okay, I just want to note here that given that there is sympathy for women in status quo, there's already a revealed preference to not necessarily harshly punish these women. And I think this is something that is key to our case, because generally speaking, mainstream society probably doesn't deem these women as like morally reprehensible people. They probably don't deem these women as like deserving the most like crucial or the most like cruel of punishments. Oftentimes, this is just a way in which you give a legal mechanism to like punish a lot of these women, right? And this is where we're going to add significant analysis to OG, because they don't tell me why specifically they are offered plea deals. I think this is the incentive, right? Because you have a legal benefit for doing so. Insofar as, 1, we have a real preference for not punishing these women, so we probably want to use these women in ways that are beneficial for like the state at large. But 2, there's just utility that's gained from this. But 3, the OO reason here is just that, I don't know, you have to justify using these resources to punish the woman in the first place. You can only justify that through like a plea deal, right? 3rd, and this is the most important thing that they don't back. Why will women actively give up crucial information that you can use to save lives? They just say that they're not trained to like to give up info in a lot of cases, or they're not trained to keep this. But here's why they take this for a bunch of other reasons. First, just prisoner's dilemma, right? You don't want to be the only person who's not giving up information when there's an active incentive for other women in your position to give up that information. You probably want the benefits of legal protection that the government is providing. You probably want to do that. 2, it's probably also in the court's interest or the legal system's interest for you to corroborate this story with other women and provide like incentives to understand like greater sort of structural ways in which this is occurring at large beyond your individual case. That probably means you can corroborate and create like a good sort of like system there. 3, you probably are less likely to be like a fundamentalist believer, and this is something that O already admits, right? Because you know the system of developing this program in the first place, so you're less likely to buy into it in the first place, right? But also you're traditionally not maximally bought into it insofar as you don't actively go out and do the bombings. But 4, you probably also actively want to do things like protect your kids. This is something that the court can promise you and say that we are going to now remove your home if you don't give up information. That means your kids are going to suffer and you have no ability to protect their lives. Like, these are something that you probably intuitively want to do, right? But even if you can literally just justify taking women out of these spaces to begin with, which means that it is much easier for them to like get people out of the radicalized system in the first place, which means that they're much likely to concede to self-interest and like to get out of that terrorist system. I think this is monumental, one, in terms of understanding the roots of the ideology. For people in the group, you can hear about, I don't know, how you can cut off supplies and where these groups are organizing, how you can prevent that from happening. But 2, just literal spies that you can send back into this organization that you can necessitate info on how to, on how you can like stop terrorism in the future, right? Okay, 2, why do we stop terrorism at its roots even if you don't believe any of this? 1, investigation is probably just likely to show that women are taking these roles in the first place. I think that broadens our understanding of what the underlying causes of terrorism are. Oftentimes there's an incentive to do this preemptively, i.e. you can catch terrorism at its earlier stages because of anti-terrorist reasons, but also creation of the legal net. Facilitates, I think this gives you a capacities change, insofar as you can it's much easier for you to get a warrant for people, for women associated with terrorism. What that then means, and the reason for that, why this is so important, is because education and indoctrination is prior to securing weapons and access to these things. I.e., you need to specifically be able to educate people to operate on this basis before you even, before you can gain access to like the key levers to go out
out and do a bombing, right? What that means then, the emphasis on why this happens is that given that this is a little understood process, once indoctrination is robustly developed and you've created a system and a doctrine that you adhere by, you will create educational leaders that can always facilitate the continuation of terrorism in the future. Even if you kill literally every terrorist in that organization, that doctrine itself exists and you can recreate this. And this is why, like, when you create the mujahideen as like the educational leaders, there can always be copycat versions of that terrorism. This is why when ISIS is conceived to be dead in the past, you will recreate, you see recreations of this, and you see fundamentally sort of redevelopment of these doctrines, and why people will continue following these sorts of things. What this means and why this is crucial for CG is if we can catch this at its earlier stages by preemptively understanding the creation of these doctrines and stopping those in its tracks, we can save so many lives, and insofar as we can do that, I think we protect the most amount of people on our side. Proud to request.
Sorry, do you mind if I go to the bathroom? They can continue with the speech. Yeah, I just.
Thus far in the debate, teams have been unable to understand how legal proceedings actually work and what would be the delta within this debate. We need to understand that legislation would change, but in order for this to actually have a change in the real world, it requires somebody to actually sue people for the types of violations to the law that are occurring. And this is very unlikely to actually happen on their side of the house, because we need to consider who would be suing the people who are violating these situations, and who would actually be defending the victims for these situations, as I will explain later within my speech. But firstly, I'll give refutations to the two main things that opening government gives us. Firstly, they tell us that women within terrorist movements will cause the most harms because they'll have the power to shift ideology. However, we believe that firstly, this is not necessarily true. Why? Because women are often victims themselves who are indoctrinated previously into terrorist ideals. This looks like women listening to the Taliban radio broadcasts and then beginning to internalize these types of ideals and then sharing them with their children, which means that they're not actually a root cause of the terrorist ideology being propagated. But even if this isn't true, women don't have as much platform as general propaganda and as other issues that are already being punished through normal legislations. And secondly, we believe that this is not the way to solve this. The way we are able to solve that women within the terrorist movement don't cause as much harm is to give them actual support and actual abilities to be able to question their ideologies and to be able to leave this entire system. Not by giving more people the means to actually sue them legally and to give them the means to punish women and put them in jail when they're not actually the ones who are creating the most harm within terrorist movements. And then secondly, they tell us that it will be that it's easier for their side of the house to be more successful because they will actually be able to litigate properly and they will actually be able to create a change. However, this is untrue for three reasons. Firstly, we believe that it is difficult to prove, as opening opposition already said. And secondly, we believe that it is very difficult to actually identify these types of violations to the law. You see, these traditionally feminist tasks will be very difficult to identify because since they're within domestic labor and within the bringing up of the children, it will be very difficult for people to actually litigate against them and be able to sue for these types of things. What does this look like? It looks like women indoctrinating people in different dinner parties or just as they bring up their kids. However, the witnesses for these types of situations are the kids themselves or the people who are actually being indoctrinated. So it's very unlikely that they will be actually capable of suing against things that they have been indoctrinated to believe themselves. This means that there's a lot less change on their side of the debate. Now, why is this relevant? Because all of the arguments that they try to prove in terms of actually changing terrorism and trying to make it a lot less likely are not actually probable on their side of the house. Then on the side of closing government, they tell us a lot of things about
POI?
no, thank you. They tell us a lot of things about how they will be directly able to impact urgency. However, we believe that this is not true. Closing government tells us that they will be able to prove coercion from others. However, we believe that we have a lot more direct impact on our side of the house. Why? Because the moment in which we're able to simply sue for things such as propaganda and direct action and the possession of weapons, there are much more tangible harms that we're actually able to prove and have successful lawsuits for. On their side of the house, their impacts are at best long-term, and they will be very difficult to actually access on their side. However, let's move on to my own concern. Our first argument will be on security, where we prove to you that we can use political capital on a better way on our side of the house, which is what I was talking about right now. We believe that there is a lot more direct impact with us. What will happen is that the political impact, the political capital that we have right now will be put into making these new legislations and put into trying to make sure that these traditionally feminine acts are regulated in a better way. And this means that it will necessarily be a trade-off from ensuring that all of these agencies are capable of continuing to litigate against to litigate against traditionally terrorist actions such as propaganda or the possession of weapons. This means that it will be a lot more difficult for legal courts to be able to do this. But even if this isn't true, we think that even opening government was able to concede to us that they will be able to use this legislation in order to prove coercion from others, which means that terrorist individuals who are actually committing real crimes will be able to blame women who brought them up for their actions that they are taking. This means that it will be a lot more hard for us to prosecute against them when they have this capability to defend themselves against this. And even if all of this isn't true, we think that when we're able to litigate about regarding propaganda and the possession of weapons, it's a lot more direct impact, and we're targeting the urgent situations that are happening right now. On their side of the house, at best, they will only be able to have a long-term impact on indoctrination, but it is very unlikely that it will happen, and even if it does, it's not something that addresses the current issues that are happening right now in terrorism, in terms of security and protecting the most vulnerable stakeholders. Then secondly, we're going to talk to you about narratives around women in terrorist organizations. We believe that here, the discourse will shift to blame the victims of these organizations themselves. And even if they aren't the victims of the organizations, the discourse entirely shifts from actually blaming the people who are committing crimes to blaming those who have already been indoctrinated in the past and who aren't even to blame for the situations that are going on right now. This is one, principally wrong, and secondly, it will have a negative impact on the courts. You see, opening government's case is depending on assuming that courts will have the capacity to differentiate between coercion and non-coercion. And we tell you that the places in which terrorism is high, courts can be biased to be misogynistic, which means the women are likely to be pushed towards these ideas, and terrorism births that misogyny is a lot more likely. So this doesn't matter if they can prove that courts would have the capacity to differentiate these instances if courts weren't going to do this in the first place. So we need to talk about this. No, thank you. But even if all of this isn't true, we think that the narrative in and of itself will show that things such as domestic roles and education are to blame for these issues, and we do not believe that this is actually true.
POI?
Yeah.
So these would be criminal cases, not civils. The prosecution is the state. The state does not have a limited capacity to sue terrorists. It will just sue all of them.
Okay, thank you. We agree that maybe they'll be able to sue all of the terrorists. However, we still think that all of our analysis is true, because it will be a lot harder for them to prove that terrorists indoctrination is actually truthful on your side of the house. Why? Because you can't really prove that someone's upbringing has led them to be a terrorist. It's going to be very difficult to obtain this kind of evidence, and it's going to take a lot more time, and it will be a lot more difficult than to simply stick with the things that we have right now and stop perpetuating negative narratives towards women and towards everyone involved. So how do we compare to other benches? We believe that we've been able to prove to you that firstly, women within the movement don't necessarily cause the most harm to shift the ideology, and that the way in which we can help this and mitigate the possible harms that they can cause is not by allowing courts to sue against women who are often put down and who are often the main victims within terrorist groups, and instead we should be using other alternatives that won't make them a further victim on their side of the house. And then secondly, we were able to prove to you that it will be a lot easier for us to be successful. Why? Because we're actually able to identify these court cases a lot more effectively, because the people who are suing against these types of situations are likely to sue, unlike those who are indoctrinated. Thank you.
we good to begin? Team by team started with OO. OO says 4 things I want to engage with. First is innocence. They say there's no intention. We explained why in many cases, and OG also explained it, there's an intention to facilitate killing, and this is more than enough. Their response is no. In many cases, there is no such intention. You don't know that you're part of a terror cell. This is where we come in uniquely and take it over our top half. We explain prosecutorial discretion. In the vast majority of countries, prosecutors can control whether or not they bring charges against someone, even if, yes, they think that person did in fact break the law. Our ultimate thesis on this point has been that innocent women simply won't be charged. Women who didn't know they were part of a terror cell won't be charged. And even though the law would allow for them to be charged. Why is all this true? We explain that there's a real preference for sympathy towards these women in these situations. Guys, this is why, in the status quo, these women aren't criminalized. Clearly, because these women aren't criminalized in the status quo, many people don't think that they're very, very guilty, and don't think that they're very, very responsible for what's being done, and don't think that the courts should be sort of put against them. Obviously, this would change somewhat if we pass this law, but not absolutely. They never approved that whatsoever. The underlying reasons for all this is like the infantilization of women, OO's entire case, and just the reason why it is that people don't want to waste resources and would rather, again, for CO's whole case, rather prioritize different actors. Also, even if you don't mind the stuff like why prosecutors are going to be like empathetic or whatever, there's also just selfish reasons to not go after the innocent women, or the women who are not maximally evil. And the reason is that many prosecutors benefit from having a perfect track record, 100% convictions. And they benefit not only to get elected in the future, also to get promotions within their job. And so oftentimes they avoid non-slam dunk cases, as Namai explained to you. This unlocks OG's analysis regarding proving things beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, second thing from OO I want to discuss is their content on less whistleblowing. But here's the point. If women are as brainwashed as they say they are, women are probably never, ever going to whistleblow in their world. What you would need in order to get women in a position where they're willing to whistleblow is to take them out of that environment, to get them sort of literally in jail while they wait sort of a consultation and whatnot, and then through that mechanism, you can de-radicalize them and make them willing to accept the deals that we uniquely show that you're going to get offered to them and that they're going to accept. Okay, great. Next, I want to flag, even if you think that they're right on innocence, the potential victims of terrorism are obviously more innocent than these women. So I think we should probably prioritize saving the lives of maximally innocent victims of terrorism rather than helping the quality of life of women who are nebulously innocent / guilty. Third thing from OO I want to discuss. They say there's more violence on women to stop these people from leaking. Terrorist cells are going to assume that they're not going to get caught. Later I'm going to do tons of analysis on like why deterrence doesn't really work or why deterrence is a wash. All of that analysis will cross-apply to how terrorist cells will react, whether they're going to respond by increasing violence on women or increasing coercion, etc. I also feel like there's a tiny possible margin of change on coercing these women more, given everything you OO have said about them. Fourth point from OO, we should be prioritizing the terrorists who are taking lives. We explain uniquely, better than our top half, way better, why it is that being preemptive is infinitely more effective. Why you can stop terrorism before the deaths have occurred, before the weapons have been supplied. We explain why we stop the doctrine from spreading to other terrorist cells by stopping its sort of cult creation and sort of evolution into a palatable, or at least maximally palatable doctrine. Okay, that's OO, yeah.
To the extent that women don't know you want to prosecute them and they have this massive brainwash or whatever, are you fine with the marginal case that they don't comply and you prosecute or weaponize a very victimized woman already?
So our whole point is that you're only going to prosecute women when they're least sympathetic, when they're least likely to engender all of the sort of like infantilization of women, all the pre-existing reasons why it is that we don't have criminalization. So our whole point, maximally evil, uber-lord women who are controlling the whole terrorist cell and doing weird things, they get prosecuted, the average woman doesn't. Okay, great, let's talk OG. 5 things from OG I want to discuss. First, they say negotiating power and then we can force plea deals. They say the words plea deals, but they don't actually net this at all. There are 2 questions you need to answer to have this point stick. 1, why are the deals offered? They have no proof whatsoever on this. Nobody gave you at least 5 reasons. Second, why are these deals accepted by the women? They give you a little bit of proof on this, and Nobody proved it far, far better. Second point from OG I want to discuss. They said if you prove coercion, then well, you just get off the hook. But as both options have pointed out, they never satisfactorily prove why it is that you can prove coercion in courtrooms. And what I proved earlier in my speech, and what I did as well, is that innocent women will be let off the hook not because they're going to win the court case, but because they won't even be prosecuted in the first place. This is significantly better than OG's analysis here. Okay, third, they say they're going to stop the root cause. How? By stopping posts on the internet. The delta here is tiny. It's unclear why it is that these posts on the internet are just taken down by companies in the status quo who don't like terrorism on their websites, by the moderators, or by governments pushing moderators and pushing these companies to stop this activity, even if it is literally criminal at that point. Next, so this is a really bad way of explaining how we stop root cause, and Nobody explained it far better. Next is deterrence, and that we're going to somehow deter all these women. The efficacy here is extraordinarily unclear, because even rational people often assume they won't get caught for crimes. This is why decades of criminological research shows that deterrence does jack shit. And so, ultimately, this is especially true for irrational people. They're maximally likely to believe they won't be caught, so thus, whether there are criminal penalties or not doesn't really matter for them. And these irrational people are the most likely to be those who join terror cells in the first place. Will they even do the utility calculus that they outlined to you that would cause deterrence to be functional? I have no idea. Plus, people are often literally unaware of the specific laws that apply to them, so this won't factor into the decisions. This isn't the knife. This is an explanation of why does the deterrence analysis applies in a tiny, tiny amount of cases. Okay, maybe it's a knife. Let's talk about the principle then. They say that we get punishment. I think, but we're just simply going to outweigh this. As OG agrees, the most important thing in this debate is saving lives. Insofar as you believe we prove this better than our top half, then we outweigh their principle, which I don't think is particularly important. Fifth thing from OG, but they say the alternative is extra legal interrogations. However, in cases where these would happen, in cases where extra legal interpretations or interrogations are possible, the rule of law is already so weak that changing the law one way or another via the motion probably would have minimal impact. So we shouldn't care about these cases. We should care about the cases that I characterized too. Great. Let's talk CO. Three things I want to discuss. First, they said there's going to be few prosecutions. This is perfect and it unlocks our whole case. It means you only have prosecutions in cases where prosecutors are confident they'll win the case because the women did tons and tons of documentable evil things and probably had malicious intent or clearly demonstrably malicious intent to overcome the empathy, the sympathy that is obviously proven by the revealed preference that I discussed earlier. And also, this is because there's true prosecutions, this is why there's a small trade-off between these prosecutions and the other prosecutions they talk so much about. Second point from CO, we need to give women support for leaving. I was to explain, societies are probably going to do this on our side as well, cross-apply all my revealed preferences stuff. Second, they can't countermodel. OG was good. They smartly didn't claim fiat power, they did likelihood analysis, so you don't get counter fiat power, and also you can't countermodel from CO. Come on. Okay, third point. They said we need to address the current issues, like fight the terrorism that are doing the terrorists right now. We've been trying to do this. We've been to directly attack terrorism for decades now. The war on terror was an abject failure. And the average reasonable person knows this. We shot at the terrorists, there became more of them. Let's probably try something new. Let's go at the underlying causes of terrorism. Let's deal with the ideologies. Let's stop them from spreading in the first place. At the end of the day, we prove way better than Pop App why we save lives, why we get the information that they gesture at, why we get these women agreeing to these deals and thus allowing agencies that are engaging in anti-terrorism activity to engage in that anti-terrorism activity significantly more efficaciously. They've agreed saving lives is the most important thing. Also, even if you think maybe we're close to them on that, we clearly broke the top half principle deadlock on like how this affects feminist women with all of our analysis on prosecutorial discretion and why it is that these women who both teams opt-ins care so much about actually won't be thrown into jail, won't have horrible things happen to them, and will be offered the support to transition out of the horrible states in which they're living in. At the end of the day, we get less terrorism. Terrorism is bad. For all those reasons, I'm so proud to propose. Thank you.
Speaker for their speech, I'd now like to invite the Wood to hold your chair.
It's simple. OG, CG, OO. First, with OG. The first thing that OG tells you is that you're going to have more charges to litigate in favor of these people, so hence it is far more likely that you will be able to grant the people who are like negatively affected by terrorism, to grant them some form of justice. And they try to preemptively outweigh like every single offense around by telling you that there are a lot of instances in which women are not coercively pushed, and hence that they do have some like capacity to be able to consciously jump in and to do these forms of terrorist acts. But the problem is that even if they do manage to prove that those are the majority of instances, and even if those are the majority of instances that does happen very frequently, the law just simply doesn't work like that. And the reason for this is quite simple, and it is because the law operates on a principle level. So for example, if someone loses $100, it would be principally unjust for you to ask me to give that person $100 because I did not have a direct correlation with that person in the first place. So hence it would be principally unjust for you to take some level of my autonomy to then grant another person's capacity to fulfill their necessity to be justice, right? And like, although they say that when women like indoctrinate children, this is something bad and this is something that is principally not able to be upheld. Like these women were coerced in the first place, so there are like opening government's case can only function when they are not able to recognize these instances of coercion. But even in the instances in which these women were not, in which these women were consciously doing these forms of action, we tell you that it is still principally unjust, because even though I do have a certain form of direct correlation with what that person is doing, it is not necessarily principally upheld, because I still have a right to uphold my own autonomy. But more importantly, it doesn't matter if like opening government can prove to you that these instances exist, if they weren't able to prove to you why that was necessarily the tipping point for the law to change, insofar as those are not the majority of like instances. And although our opening does respond to this point, we attack the direct principle claim that OG gives to you to justify their claim, insofar as it is principally illegitimate for me to sacrifice something in the law, so that another person gets their justice. It is not necessarily clear as to why that happened. So sure, OG responds with a lot of practical damages. We prove to you why principally this is not correct. So onto CG. The extension that we get from CG is that there is a revealed preference for like these courts to not punish these women already. But our extension clearly clashes with this when we tell you that no, this is not necessarily true, that in the instances where terrorism does come about, courts can have a tendency to be incredibly misogynistic, and also how terrorism births this condition of misogyny. Why is this incredibly important? Because first, there is no structural reason to prove on CG as to why these courts have a revealed preference, other than the fact that they say, oh, but these women are not prosecuted in the first place, so hence like they do have a revealed preference. First, I don't think this is necessarily true, but secondly, just because they aren't prosecuted, it doesn't mean that they are favored in the first place.